Scripture reading for this morning's lesson comes from Luke chapter 22, verse 42. That's Luke chapter 22, verse 42. Saying, Father, if thou wilt be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done.
We're thankful you're here today. We know we have visitors with us, and we're awfully glad you're here. Hope that you will come back every chance that you have. The text for today's lesson is Matthew 26 and 27, Mark 14 and 15, Luke 22 and 23, John 18 and 19. I won't have time to reference every particular detail that I mentioned. I won't get in every detail that's there. It is my aim this morning to give us an overview of things that could be studied in depth and have been studied in depth for 2,000 years, but then remind us of a few things that come out of that overview. Right after Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper that we just partook of, and we've been celebrating for as long as I can remember and for as long as Jesus has left this earth, we celebrate his death and until he comes again, he says in 1 Corinthians 11. Right after we memorialize that he instituted that supper on the night before his death, he went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. He probably would have crossed the brook Kidron, as we mentioned last week, and went over maybe a bridge or maybe through the water, come to the Mount of Olives, and on the Mount of Olives there was a garden. The garden was called Gethsemane, which means oil press, and so it's very likely that there were some olive trees there. He left 9 of the disciples, 8 of them, because Jesus had already left, and took 3 with him. He took Peter, James, and John with him a little bit closer, but then he left Peter, James, and John and went a little bit farther, some of the scriptures say. One passage says about a stone's throw from them, and then he begged God. He begged God that he might not have to go through with everything that had been planned for him from before the foundation of the world. He said, please, let this cup pass from me. The cup was the cup of his sufferings. The cup had been planned for him from before the foundation of the world, had been prophesied from the time that Adam and Eve were in the garden. It had been worked through the nation of Israel as soon as God started calling Abraham to form that nation of Israel. It had come down through the Old Testament prophets, and now the time was here. And he prayed, please, let me out of this. But then, most importantly, though he might have been tempted, he never yielded to such temptation. He prayed, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. I'm thankful we have a Lord who became a human so that we could identify with the things that he endured and he could identify with the things that we endured. Sometimes we don't feel like doing things, but we know it's the right thing to do because God said it. He prayed that prayer 3 times, in between each time coming back to the disciples and finding them asleep. The ones that he could count on as the closest to him, he went and found them asleep. And he chastised them gently. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak, he said compassionately. And then when he got done with those 3 prayers, I might add that Hebrews chapter 5 verse 7 indicates that this wasn't just a quiet, solemn whisper of a prayer. It was with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from heaven. He said to the disciples toward the end of that, come on, let us be going, let us arise from here. And then other events started to transpire. If you take a synopsis, a harmony of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then how John records it, it may have gone in some order like this. Jesus sees the detachment of troops from the Romans along with the soldiers from the Jewish chief priests and officers coming towards him. He steps toward them and says, whom are you seeking? When he says, whom are you seeking? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. He says, I am, or I am he, and they all fall back to the ground. We don't know if that was miraculous. We don't know if they were just amazed at the strength of his presence. Remember, they had been before. They didn't arrest him in John chapter 7 because they said, no one ever spoke like this man. When he set himself out to them, they fell on the ground. Then he asked them again, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Somewhere in there, Judas, who was a money lover, had bargained with them to betray the Lord for 30 pieces of silver. And he said, the one I kiss, that's him. So Judas went up to the Lord and started to betray him with a kiss. Jesus asked him about it, but Judas went ahead with it. and he betrayed him. And then that battalion of soldiers that came to arrest the most mild man that ever walked the face of the earth escorted him back to the house of Annas. Annas had been the high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. He'd been deposed after that, and it was about 15 years before Jesus ever came to this moment in his life, about 12 years before Jesus came to earth, that he was deposed. But during that time, Annas pulled some strings. He was really the one still in power. He had 5 sons that served in the high priesthood and 1 son-in-law. The priesthood had degraded from what God intended it to be. He intended it to be a holy office from the tribe of Levi, from the line of Aaron. But now it became a Roman political appointee office. And now his son-in-law Caiaphas was the official high priest, but a lot of people looked to Annas as the real high priest, so they went to his house probably first, if I understand it right. Maybe not first, but it looks to me like they went to his house first and had some sort of informal trial there. John records it in John 18, 12 through 14, and 19 through 24. And in that informal trial, they asked Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus is not a smart aleck, but he's no one to back down from someone who's trying to mock him, trying to push him around. He says to them, I stood with you daily in the temple, always teaching, always telling you what was going on. I did nothing in secret. Everything was out in the open. Ask the people who heard me what my disciples and my doctrine are. When he said that, one of the officers of the high priest turned around and slaps Jesus upside the head. He said, do you speak to the high priest like that? Jesus replied, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? He didn't sin by talking that way to the high priest. After that, they led him to the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the official high priest at that time. It was probably still during the night or very early in the morning. We get some indication that it might have been between 3 and 6 in the morning, which was illegal. You couldn't have trials like that during the night that had to do with the death penalty and things like that, but they didn't care about legality at this point. They just wanted Jesus dead. And so Caiaphas begins to question Jesus. They start lining up witnesses against Jesus. It's a parade of witnesses. It's a kangaroo court. They bring in witness after witness. They're trying desperately to get 2 or 3 witnesses to agree, because that was the standard by which you could convict somebody of a capital crime under the Old Testament law, Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 19. But they can't find anybody that agrees until 2 finally come close, saying, well, we heard him say that he was going to destroy the temple and then build it in 3 days. Well, he had said something close to that, but not quite that. And he wasn't speaking of the literal temple. He was speaking of the temple of his body that would be resurrected in 3 days, John chapter 2 records. But that was enough for them. Caiaphas is having it up to here, so he starts playing the bully card. And he says, tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of God. I find it interesting that Jesus never answered any of the false accusations. He was like a sheep going to the slaughter, as Isaiah prophesied. But when they asked him something about the truth, he confirmed it. Tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of God. It is as you say, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel saw in a vision how there'd be these great kingdoms and the Ancient of Days, but then the Son of Man would come to the Ancient of Days, the God, Father of heaven, and get his kingdom, power, and glory and honor. I am the Son of God, Jesus is saying, and he knew that they knew what that would mean. And I'm the one that's going to get the kingdom that's been prophesied for all this time. Well, the high priest had it. He started to tear his clothes in dramatic fashion. He said, what do we need more? We've heard blasphemy. Well, it would be blasphemy if he wasn't God, but he was God, so it wasn't blasphemy. Well, we need more. We've heard blasphemy here. Let's take him and let's crucify him. So, before they take him out to Pilate, we get some offshoots that maybe we'll study later. The Apostle Peter, right after the Lord's Supper and before they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, has said, Lord, I will die with you. And Jesus said, no. Before the rooster crows, Mark records twice, you'll deny me 3 times. No, Lord, I'll die with you. Well, while he's in Caiaphas' court down below, around a fire, are huddled a lot of the Jewish people, some of Jesus' enemies, and Peter's standing there with them, and a servant girl says to him, you were with him, weren't you? No, I was not. The servant girl starts to tell others and maybe accuses him, and maybe some others do too if you put all the accounts together. And it seems to be like the word is spreading throughout the courtyard. You were with him. No, I was not. You were with him. No, I was not. And the third time he began to curse and swear, Mark says, I was not with him. And right then, the rooster crowed, and across the courtyard, Jesus caught Peter's eyes. Can you imagine the human emotion of desertion that Jesus is feeling? Judas had already betrayed him. Judas, about this time, it says in Matthew chapter 27, is very sorry that he betrayed him when he saw what transpired. He takes the 30 pieces of silver back to the temple and says to the chief priests and elders, I've done wrong. He said, we don't care. What's that to us? You see to it. So he throws the 30 pieces of temple down, and he goes out and he kills himself. Hangs himself. The book of Acts would later say that apparently he rotted there so long that his entrails gushed out. Became an example for all. Peter would later receive forgiveness. Judas didn't give the Lord a chance to forgive him. After Caiaphas' household, they lead him to the house of Pilate. Pilate is the Roman governor. The Jews were under Roman rule at this time. The Jews were under the Roman Empire at this time. And they had some freedoms, but they didn't have all freedoms. They had to listen to the Romans some, and they didn't like that at all. They wanted to throw the yoke off of Rome. Part of the controversy about Jesus was, is he going to be the one that finally throws the yoke of Rome off of us? Is he going to be the political leader that stands up like Judas Maccabeus had done a couple hundred years before that in intertestamental times? Is he going to be the one? Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And he said that while he was with Pilate. Now, the exact sequence of what happens in Pilate is hard for me to decipher exactly. You read those chapters for yourself, and I'll just try to hit some highlights for you. When they bring him to Pilate, they say, we found this fellow perverting our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, both of which were lies. Jesus had said in Matthew 22, you pay your taxes to Caesar. You give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God's what is God's. But they don't care that it's a lie. They just want him dead. Finally, Pilate's going to ask Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? John records the longer answer. Eventually, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. First he asks Pilate, he says, are you asking this for yourself, or did others tell you this about me? Where are you coming from exactly? Pilate said, am I a Jew? I got no game in this. I don't have a dog in this fight. Why are you claiming to be the king of the Jews? Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, I think what he's saying to Pilate is, you'd lose. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. John 18, verse 36. Pilate wants clarification. He says, are you a king then? Jesus affirms, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I've come into the world. He takes it a step further than kinghood. He says, I came to bear witness to the truth, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. That's why we follow him today. We don't follow him because of great political promises. We don't follow him because he's going to give us a great economy. We don't follow him because he's going to throw off the yoke of slavery of nations, of this nation and that nation. We follow him because he has and he is the truth, John 14, verse 6. And that's higher than any king could ever claim. Pilate cynically notes it when he then replies, what is truth? Then Pilate, I don't know how I feel about Pilate. He was a coward. He wouldn't stand up to the Jewish people. But also he knew that Jesus was innocent. Acts chapter 3 verse 13 says that Pilate was determined to let Jesus go. You see it. You can see it in Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's account, and then you see it in John. He comes out after the exchange about the king and says to the people, the Jews, I find no fault in him. Well, let's go back. And so then he wants to try to satisfy the crowd, so he gives Jesus a scourging. And the Roman soldiers, they're going to mock Jesus, so they put a crown of thorns on his head. And one commentator said those thorns were likely, some of them maybe 12 inches long, and they would pierce into the scalp. And they twist that crown of thorns on his head, take a purple robe and put it on him so that they can mock him as a king. Oh, look at you, the king of the Jews. What a crown you have. And they slapped him. Oh, I admitted. In Caiaphas' court, they slapped him too. I believe in Annas' court, they slapped him too. They slapped him and they spit on him. In Caiaphas' court, they blindfolded him and they were making a mockery of him. They said, prophesy to us. Who's the one just slapped you? You can't see us. Tell us the name of the guy that slapped you. He could have. He didn't. In Pilate's court, they bow the knee to him, treat him with contempt, hit his head with a reed. And then, after all of that, in John 19:5, Pilate brings him out to the people with the crown of thorns on, the pathetic, bloodied figure, bruised, with a purple robe on, and says, or maybe they've taken the robe off at this point, I forget. But he says, behold the man. Here's the man that you find such a danger. Here's the man that you find so threatening. Now, at some point in this exchange, he'll ask them, you know what? I know a way out of this. I often release to you one of your political prisoners at the Passover time. So how about I release Jesus to you? And they say, no, crucify him. We want Barabbas. Barabbas was everything they claimed Jesus was. He was a treasonous man. He was a murderer. Well, they didn't go that far with Jesus, but they claimed, but Barabbas was a treasonous man who had committed murder in the rebellion, one writer says. He was a robber. He was everything evil. He was one who took life. The irony of it is displayed in Acts chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where Peter is preaching. He tells that crowd, you asked for a murderer to be granted to you and killed the Prince of Life. So they wanted Barabbas. Pilate, that didn't work for you either. So Pilate comes out again when he brings out Jesus saying, behold the man. He says, I find no fault in him. And they say to him, well, essentially, we still want him. We still want him dead. Pilate said to them, I find no fault in him, Acts 19, verse 6, and it's Acts 19, verse 7. They say, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Now that gets Pilate's attention. You're a king, I can deal with kings. I got the emperor behind me. Son of God? He comes back to Jesus and he says, probably with some sense of awe, who are you? Jesus won't answer. Pilate tries to pull the power card. Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you? Then Jesus reminds him, you would have no power at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now, how Caiaphas or the Jews or whoever he's referring to had the greater sin, I'm not sure. One suggestion is this. Pilate so far has been acting within the governing authority that he had. He's getting out of line, but so far he's only done what his governing authority has given him to do. But Caiaphas, he's way out of line. He shouldn't even be high priest. He's way out of line with any kind of governing authority that might have been given by God. Maybe that's it. I don't know for sure. After that, Pilate sought to release him. Pilate was intent on releasing him. John 19, verse 12. But the Jews cried out, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Now maybe by this time, but for sure later, it became an official title, friend of Caesar. You'd be a friend of Caesar, that means you had some high privileges, some high ranks, you'd be invited to state dinners and all that sort of thing. You're not a friend of Caesar if you let this man go. And that caught Pilate's attention because he knew he had to answer to the emperor and everything, his political career, maybe his life would be on the line. So Matthew records that he takes a tub of water, washes his hands, and says, I'm free of this matter. You see to it yourselves. His blood's not on my hands. And they say, his blood be on us and on our children's head. Man, I might tell you sometime I'll take the blame for something, but I'll never tell you. I'll let my son take the blame for that, or my daughter. But that's what they did that day. That's how desperately they wanted him dead. And then Pilate comes out to the judgment seat, pavement, Gabbatha, And he says to them, "Behold your king." And the people can only shout, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar." And so they took him and led him away. John says he started bearing his cross. The synoptic writers say Simon the Cyrenian bore his cross. I don't know if they handed off at one point or another, or why, or for what purpose. But he carried what would have been likely the horizontal beam, and when he got there to the crucifixion site on Golgotha, the place of the skull, if history is true, then they would have laid that horizontal beam down, nailed him to it, nailed his feet to it, picked it up and thrust it into the ground. And for the next 6 hours, some crucifixion victims lasted for days, but only for Jesus for the next 6 hours, he'd have to lift himself up against the pressing of those nails for every breath. And most crucifixion victims died of suffocation. It was the most torturous death known ever in the history of the world. That's probably one of the reasons that Jesus came when he did, so we can't say he didn't suffer enough. And they wanted it to last. They didn't want a death to be too quick. So they crucified him. There was just a little bit of mercy, and some of the people bringing some sour wine that was sort of a mixture to be a sedative to give to him, but Jesus refused that sedative. It'd be like saying, I don't want the Tylenol, I don't want the OxyContin while I'm here on the cross. I'm going to suffer everything that I'm supposed to suffer. This is the plan from the foundation of the world. They took his garments and they divided them among themselves, the Roman soldiers did, but his tunic, the undergarment, was of fine linen. It didn't have any seams in it, so they gambled for it and fulfilled Psalm 22, verse 18. Can you imagine the callousness? They crucified him between two robbers, so there are three guys heaving for every breath, bleeding, and the crowd is around, and the Roman soldiers, well, that's just another day's work to them. Let's pass the time with some cards, some gambling, and let's gamble for this man's tunic, for God's piece of clothing. And then the people came by. The passers-by mocked him. If you're the Son of God, come down off the cross. Show us. Like he hadn't done anything before to show them that he was the Son of God. The chief priests and officers come by. If you're the Son of God, come down off the cross. The robbers, at least one of them, said, if you're the Son of God, save yourself and us. And the other one had some sort of penitence to make. When Jesus was first put on the cross, according to Luke, he looked down at all those enemies that he had and proclaimed, prayed, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. A little bit later, that thief said to the one who mocked him, don't you see that we're under the same condemnation? And we're getting what we deserve, but this man's done nothing wrong. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Salvation of that man has nothing to do with the way I'm saved today, because I wasn't that man. I'm after Christ died. He was before Christ died. That's a lesson that's been covered recently, so I won't dwell there. Jesus had mercy even while things were really the worst they could possibly be for him. And he took care of his mother. The disciple whom Jesus loved was probably John. John 19, 25 through 27 records how Jesus looked from the cross and said to John, behold your mother. And said to his mom, behold your son. Meaning, you take care of her from now on. There weren't any government programs. Your family took care of family. But the trouble was, it may have been the case that Joseph, Mary's husband, had already died. And it was the case that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. John chapter 7, verse 5. So somebody's got to take care of his mom. And he has the faculties to take care of that while he's on the cross. Towards the end, he says, I thirst. Probably in quick sequence. I don't know, because I can't get all this together. But at the 9th hour, there was darkness over the land from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22, verse 1. See how he felt? He's bearing the sins of the world, besides just dying. If you could even call that just dying. He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Finally, he cries, it is finished. And that word for finished means completed. He's not talking about the cross that day is finished. He's not talking about those things that happened that weekend being finished. He's not talking about the Passover week being finished. He's talking about the plan from before the foundation of the world, that he watched from heaven and inspired prophets and knew that he was going to come, and he came as a little baby and was raised into teen years and came into young adult years and worked as a carpenter, ministered for 3 years and took persecution from people and did signs and wonders, and nobody believed him, and they hung him on a cross just as it was prophesied. It is done. Now, Jesus had said to his disciples on the night before his death, greater love has no one than this, than that one should lay down his life for his friends. His laying down his life for his friends reminds us of many things. I'll just point out some real quickly. One, this was no accident. At the heart of all premillennial doctrine, the doctrine that says Christ hasn't established his kingdom yet, the doctrine that says Christ is going to reign on earth for 1,000 years, at the heart of all that is the doctrine that Jesus' death was an accident and he didn't see it coming. They say he came to establish his kingdom. He didn't see it coming. God didn't see it coming, but the Jews killed him, and so he established his church instead, and later he'll establish his kingdom. That's at the heart of everything, and it couldn't possibly be more wrong. Jesus had every characteristic of God. God has every characteristic and never even emptied himself of it except in the person of Jesus, Philippians 2, verse 7. And they're omniscient. They know everything. Omnipotent. Jesus could have taken 12 legions of angels and wiped out Jerusalem at that time, he said. This was no accident. This was the plan from before the foundation of the world. And that ought to say something about his love to you. Do you ever get anxious when you know something big is coming and you know some stressor is going to come in your life? For an eternity, Jesus knew he was going to be on this cross. He loved you the whole time before you were born. This love shows us something of the antipathy. The kindest man that ever was. The strongest character that ever was. The most mild, most forgiving man that ever was. Died without a friend, even standing by him. They all forsook him and fled. Sometimes we want to be nice to people and we think we'd like to get everybody to get along with us. But the one we follow, at the time that he was doing God's will the most, got along with nobody except his Father. And this ought to tell us something about atheism. Atheism has no love like this. There are good people who are atheists. But the logic of their doctrine borne out is that I'll do what I want to do, and if you get in my way, I'll take you out of my way. This beats that 1,000 times over. Besides being true, this is great sacrificial love like the world had not known before, and like sometimes it seems it's about to forget. And this love speaks sometimes maybe to apathy. I have to ask myself if I care enough. I have to ask myself if I'm prioritizing enough. I have to ask myself if I'm doing enough. And I know his grace saves me. But you know what 1 John 3:16 says? By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Am I willing to lay down my life for you? Are you willing to lay down your life for the people across from you? How much? When we talk about service to the Lord, when we talk about attending services, when we talk about doing things outside, when we talk about giving, when we talk about anything that our lives are encompassed with, it's not about how much do I have to do, The question, if you look at this story correctly, is how much do I get to do? How much can I possibly do? And thanks for this great gift. Well, I hope the overview has helped us to some degree. There might be three categories of people that are here this morning. One is a Christian who hasn't done anything publicly wrong but wants to do better. Just make that determination between yourself and your God in private prayer. One might be a Christian who's sinned in such a public way that he or she just needs to confess it to the church and ask them for the prayers of themselves so that they can help overcome it, be helped to overcome it, be forgiven by God. And another category might be those who've never put on Christ in baptism. He died, he was buried, and 3 days later he was resurrected. He has all glory. He has all power. He has all authority. Follow him. There's nothing else worth doing. Everything else is ancillary. Follow him. This is real. This is true. This is giving. This is love. Follow him. Confess a faith in him, he said. Repent of your sins, he said. And be baptized for the remission of sins, he said. If we could help you in any way, would you come forward while we stand and sing?